some interesting authors. And of course, folks who can then comment on some really fascinating books. And we're starting today with a book called The Engagement that I hope folks have had the chance to take a look at. It's already being described as the authoritative account of the history of our nation's battle over marriage equality. It turns out that Sasha Eisenberg, who I've known for some time, he's here on the call. Of course, we're going to be talking about the book with him, but he's been working on this for about 10 years now. In fact, he actually started work on it, maybe a little less than 10 years, but started work on it before the Supreme Court case came down that legalized marriage equality. And so he just knew that he was stepping into a fascinating subject. And of course, it's turned out to be something that's really been earth-shattering. And Sasha will talk about how this is one of those subject matters that has totally flummoxed public opinion researchers who have shown that on this topic, Americans shifted more quickly than on any other topic of any other major social issue. So quickly, so fundamentally. A recent poll just came out, Sasha and I were just talking, that showed that now a majority of Republicans favor marriage equality, which is pretty extraordinary. And it turns out there's a long history. I thought I knew the basic history. Now that I've been going through the book, there's so much more to this story than I knew. And it actually turns out that a lot of the history takes place right close to home, in and around Los Angeles, West Hollywood, etc. So there's quite a lot that we can be kind of interested, quite a lot of local interest as well. But before we dive in, I just want to take a moment to talk very briefly about why we chose this book, why this topic is so important. I think we can take real pride that California has long been at the forefront of the movement for LGBT civil rights. We were the first state in the nation to legalize domestic partnerships for same-sex couples in 1999. More recently, we were the first to ban youth conversion therapy and implement LGBTQ inclusive history curriculum for our schools. We've recently passed AB 746, which was by my colleague Sabrina Cervantes, that addresses many of the challenges and barriers in the adoption process faced by LGBTQ families. AB 218 that we just passed as well, Assemblymember Chris Ward's bill, will now ensure that transgender Californians can more easily update their marriage certificates and birth certificates for their children, better protecting them from potential discrimination. So lots of interesting things that we've done. Of course, California was also one of the first states to as you see in the book, we passed lots of laws around civil unions before the question of marriage. But in addition, we also have passed some of the most comprehensive rules prohibiting discrimination in employment and housing for LGBT people. And of course, there's still quite a lot to do nationally on that topic. And there continues to be a lot of challenges that we're going to talk about in the discussion that we have after we chat with Sasha about his book. So as many as you may know, this is actually October's LGBTQ History Month. And there's certainly no bigger victory in LGBTQ history that I can think of than the legalization of same-sex marriage in 2015. It was a 25-year plus struggle. In many respects, goes back even further. I mean, there was I think in 1970, the first couple in Minnesota tried to apply for a marriage license, and of course, that case went up to their state Supreme Court, and they were turned down. Anyhow, it's a great honor to represent, to recognize and introduce Sasha Eisenberg, who is a talented journalist and a great reporter, and also a talented author who's written several books, including one about the internationalization of sushi. He's also written a book about the new political campaigns and the use of analytics. It's called Moneyball for Politics. It's called The Victory Lab. So I recommend both of those books to you, but I also recommend this new book, The Engagement, that he's just come out with. So let me just start. Sasha, tell me how you came to this topic in the first place. How is it that you came to write about this subject?
Yeah, I mean, so the first thing was sort of that mystery that you mentioned, Senator, which is about a decade ago, I was just having, while reporting that last book, The Victory Lab, having a lot of conversations with pollsters or people who measured public opinion in some way or another who would over and over again say that they hadn't seen attitudes move as quickly on any issue as they'd seen them move on marriage. And nobody had a really good explanation for that. And it was around the time that we were starting to talk about this as the sort of defining social movement of my generation. I think you and I are close to a similar age. And I had grown up, I'd been sort of shaped reading a lot of big books about the civil rights movement, the movement for racial equality. Most of them were written by journalists starting in the mid to late 70s that were, the first real effort to document the sort of whole arc of this big defining battle in American life. And it seemed to me, just as somebody who had been, covering politics, but not writing about gay rights issues or the marriage fight in particular, that this was sort of going to occupy a comparable place in the lives of our generation, and that the time that there had sort of come that you could begin to think about the whole arc of this struggle. Now, obviously, as you mentioned, I didn't foresee that there would be the sort of resolution to it that during the time I was working on it, but that's sort of what set me on this road about 10 years ago.
Yeah. What do you think? Something like having delved so deeply into this subject matter that I think we all think we know. I think we all think we know this story, and yet when you get into this book, you realize how much more there is to know. I mean, obviously, Evan knew it all, but what are some things that you think are most misunderstood in the general public with regards to this story of how we got to equality?
I mean, I think that there's this natural impulse when something ends at the Supreme Court and you have a landmark decision that, as you say, sort of extended a right to a whole class of people who'd been denied it, to assume that it was inevitable, to assume that because we sort of end at this moment of justice that it was preordained. And one of the things that I think really was revelation to me in the research, and I hope comes through in the book, is the extent to which no part of this was inevitable. It wasn't inevitable that it would come to the Supreme Court when it did. It wasn't inevitable that one side would triumph, but it also wasn't inevitable that this would emerge among the whole sort of bundle of issues that the LGBT community faced over the last generation as the one that caught fire and found success nationally. And so, some of what's surprising is the number of places, times, over the course of the sort of 25-year story I tell, where, serendipity, good fortune, unintended consequences, sort of intersect in a way that elevates this to the to the type of issue it became. Right.
So what do you credit with? I know this is the book talks quite a bit, but what are some of the key forces that led people to shift so fundamentally in their opinions about this topic?
A big one is people coming out, right? And so, one of the things that's just really important to recognize is that, unlike certainly, racial or ethnic identity, people choose the conditions under which they acknowledge, announce their not just sexual orientation, but gender identity as well. And if we assume that gays and lesbians are, more or less evenly distributed among the population, that means that as gays and lesbians felt more comfortable due to, cultural acceptance coming out, they were coming out in straight, homes with straight parents, and in, neighborhoods where their neighbors or classmates or coworkers were straight. And so straight people were being introduced to gays and lesbians in a way that doesn't necessarily happen with other forms of exposure, right? I mean, biology's like sort of the fundamentally desegregating influence here. There are not a lot of Black kids who are being born to white parents, or Muslim kids who are being born to Catholic parents, or immigrant kids who are being born to native born parents, but there were a lot of gay kids who are being born to straight parents. And you know, sociologists, social scientists call this contact theory, the idea that basically being exposed to people makes you more open to their concerns. And you know, the rate at which people have come out, and Americans have realized that they know somebody in their lives who's gay or lesbian is the most significant driver of this. And then on top of that, you have, you know, a real change, I think, in the way that folks who were doing the work on this issue communicated about it. You know, and then one big thing, you know, I think it's Evan's line that I think I quote at some point in here that, you know, our weapon is that our opponents are dying off. You know, there's just a huge generational turnover element here. And one of the things you saw in polling throughout the life of this issue is that young people in any subgroup were always more liberal than old people. So among African Americans, among evangelicals, among men, among women, it was just always that the most receptive group was the youngest, and that, you know, the passage of time was ultimately friendly to changing, you know, the country towards majority support.
And we'll talk to, I mean, Kathleen and Evan, you know, you know, there's some of their work is actually mentioned in the book, in all this exhaustive work trying to convince people over years, and just by person by person by person. So we'll talk to them a little bit about it. You know, of course, we've had a lot of is one of the things that I used while I was reading the book, Sasha, was of course the lens of all the racial reckoning that we've been grappling with as a nation, as a society over the last couple of years. And there's a really interesting interweaving of issues relating to race that go through your book. One of the things that struck me was the first couple that you highlight, one of the pioneer couples in Hawaii that lead to the modern movement, involved a person of color. Can you highlight some stories of people of color that you think are of interest in your book that might deserve some special mentioning?
Yeah, so that Hawaii couple you mentioned, one half of it's a woman named Janora Dancel. Her Filipino family, grew up in Oahu, was sort of slow to come out of the closet. Around the age of, I believe, 29, she falls in love with a woman named Nania Bear. This is summer of 1990. Janora is not fully out to her, you know, her world. And they're together for just a few months when all of a sudden Nania gets an earache and does not have health insurance. And Janora, her girlfriend then of just a few months, does have health insurance. And at that time, West Hollywood had a domestic partnership ordinance, for example. Nania Bear had lived in New York, which had just passed one for city employees. And she had no idea whether there was a similar law in place in Hawaii. She calls the local gay and lesbian community center in Honolulu and says, "Hey, is there any way I can benefit from my girlfriend's health insurance?" And she is told, no, there's no such law in place in Honolulu or anywhere in Hawaii. But the guy who answers the phone tells her that he wants to challenge the state's marriage laws. So that this guy named Bill Woods, who's the sort of driving force at the beginning of this book, who's the gay activist in Hawaii through much of the 70s and 1980s. And he ends up in this very petty fight that I detail for control of a pride planning committee. And it leads him to launch this PR stunt to take 3 couples to the Hawaii Public Health Department and request marriage licenses. And Bill Woods was not a lawyer. He had no legal strategy. He was doing it in part to force the hand of the local ACLU that he thought was sort of blowing him off on this. They request marriage licenses. The ACLU doesn't want to represent them. They get handed to a local civil rights attorney who sues the state. And 2 years later, the Hawaii Supreme Court becomes the first court on earth to recognize that the fundamental right to marriage could extend to same-sex couples. Evan, who was then working for a national organization, became a co-counsel on the case. One of the things that's really important about Janora Dancel in this story is because this case happened fairly organically, it was not sort of strategized as a test case the way most of the famous civil rights cases today or in the past were. This wasn't a public interest lawyer who decided that he wanted to sue and then went out and got couples that were the sort of perfect vehicle for the lawsuit. These were real people who sort of stumbled into this lawsuit, and there wasn't a political infrastructure to support them. And so, Janora Dansel, it's not only her name's on the lawsuit, but she and Nania Bear end up having to become the spokespeople for this suit, raise money for it, help build a coalition that is going to ultimately have to fight in the legislature and fight at a ballot referendum when opponents, much as they did later in California, try to amend the state constitution to ban this. And so she's a major figure. One of the things you see in Hawaii, in part because it's not a majority white state, it's not a majority Christian state, is that a lot of the major actors are people of color. On the sort of committee of activists that rises up to sort of make to organize around marriage, which there hadn't been before. The woman who leads the campaign in 1998, a former vice speaker of the state house, Jackie Young, was a Korean American woman. And so you do see, and Hawaii is the state that ends up, basically making this a viable legal objective for Americans and a real national issue. And a lot of the people who are sort of, carrying that that fight in the political sphere, in addition to in court, are people of color and women of color in particular.
No, Sasha spends a lot of time in the book really getting into the details of these battles in Hawaii, and it's fascinating. It's a fascinating description and kind of a little window into the political culture there too. Let's bring it closer to home. Any stories? I represent obviously LA, West Hollywood. Any stories you want to highlight from Los Angeles about how our own local communities here played an important role in this story?
Yeah, I have a scene in the book that January of 1996, a panel discussion in West Hollywood that the sort of ring-led by the LGBT Center. And Evan was on that panel. Dan Foley, who was the attorney who filed the suit in 1991 in Hawaii, was on that panel. Andrew Sullivan, who was sort of the most prominent, I think, commentator, journalistic voice in favor of marriage equality going back to the late 1980s, was on that panel. And it was important, not just because it was this moment that the folks who were involved in the Hawaii case were in a position to try to sort of, build support for it on the mainland. But I write about how the LA LGBT Center was really the first significant gay institution on the mainland to take hold of marriage as a cause. There was, as there is, a large menu of concerns to, the LGBT community, and groups have to decide where they're going to put their time and money and priorities. And for a lot of groups, local and national, marriage was not a priority through the mid 1990s. And I write about Lori Jean, who is the executive director of the center at the time, and she created I think it was called the Freedom to Marry Task Force, which was the first sort of effort on the mainland to bring groups together to specifically work on marriage, anticipating that the sort of political conflict and legal opportunities from Hawaii would spill over into other states. And one of the points she makes, and I go into this in a little bit of detail, is she suggests, that there was a lot more interest in marriage in Los Angeles than there was among gays and lesbians in San Francisco. And part of the way she described it, and I might be oversimplifying slightly, was that there were these sort of, abstract ideological debates within the San Francisco community over the merits of marriage. Is it too conservative? Is it too heteronormative? Does it not, reflect feminist values within the community? And then in LA, where the center was not just a kind of place for abstract debates and intellectual stimulation, but was a real provider of social services, primarily around HIV/AIDS, but also stuff for youth and otherwise. And people were far more concerned with the material benefits that marriage would offer them, and that it was much easier to build interest in the community in Los Angeles than it was elsewhere, even in a city like San Francisco, where obviously there's a big gay and lesbian community, but the institutions were less built around kind of delivering, material life and death benefits. And, there was this abstract debate, but what became really clear to a lot of folks across class lines, frankly, is that there are benefits that can be, that are obtainable, either only through marriage, or unless you have exceptional means, primarily through marriage, like being a beneficiary of a partner's health insurance, for example, and that the LGBT Center in Los Angeles was one of the first institutions to sort of help make that case to its constituency.
Yep. Okay. I want to ask by the way, folks, Sasha is actually a neighbor of ours. He lives in Santa Monica, so he's another District 26 resident. One last question that I want to open up to the panelists. One of the many, so you spend a lot of time talking to people who are fighting for marriage equality. You also, there's so much in this book about the folks who are aggressively fighting against same-sex marriage, and that's a whole fascinating story too, that I really had no idea about it, and there's so much in the book about it. Tell me how much of that infrastructure still exists, the folks who were opposed, and what are they up to now?
Yeah, so a lot of it does still exist in some form or another, occasionally under a slightly different name. But one of the things that was remarkable, I think, we think back to June 2015 when the Supreme Court ruled in Obergefell, and I think everybody felt it was momentous, but it was not a big surprise. And one of the things, there was not a lot of suspense. And what you saw was, even before the court heard arguments in Obergefell, the folks who were going to be on the losing end of that decision already knew what was coming. And they began to shift their priorities, and a lot of the infrastructure and funding and capacity that had been developed and built out over 20 years of trying to fight same-sex marriage became shifted, I think, in sort of three separate directions. One was trying to win, religious freedom, religious liberty exemptions, legislatively or through courts, often to protect, in their view, the rights of individuals to or institutions as private actors not to have to recognize the sort of consequences of marriage equality. The other thing is all the fights that we're seeing over issues related to gender identity. A lot of that is capacity that was built to fight marriage and went somewhere else. And then we see a little bit of the global fight, which is, there are still, I think it's, a lot of countries where private consensual gay sex remains criminalized, for, sort of at the bottom of the sort of hierarchy of legal needs, and only 30 out of 200 or so countries on earth that have legalized same-sex marriage, and a whole lot in between. And you have seen a sort of export of some of the money and expertise of folks who were engaged in anti-gay activism in the United States and sort of saw it lost here, but saw a big world where they could still sort of shape laws from a position of cultural strength.
That's a whole nother book, right? The extent to which some of our culture wars have been exported, and the fights that take place in other countries. And some allusions to it here, but I'd love to talk to you more about it. Well, let me open up the discussion. We've got three fantastic folks who are going to make some comments and give their thoughts, share their experiences. Of course, I see Evan Wolfson here, who's unfortunately we've lost him to the East Coast. But Evan is a prominent figure throughout the book. He pops up quite a bit. He's a lawyer. He's an advocate. He's an author. He was the founder and president of Freedom to Marry campaign, and of course, it was a role in which he basically drove he helped to drive the legal strategy that ended up leading to the court's marriage equality decision. So an immensely important figure in this momentous story. I'm also proud to welcome Mayor Pro Tem of West Hollywood, Seppi Shine, who's a lawyer, a civil rights leader. I think the first person of color elected to the West Hollywood City Council in its history. And here's what's wild. She's the first out LGBTQ person of Iranian origin elected anywhere to public office in the world. So a total trailblazer in her own right. And I'm sure we will be finding you in the index of a future book about civil rights. And then finally, but last but not least, Kathleen Cappasano, who's the deputy director of the LA LGBT Center that was just discussed, which provides vital services to more LGBTQ people than any other organization in the world. And I had the great honor of being there not long ago. And let me start with you, Kathleen. I mean, you've been in the fight for a long time. And part of what Sasha writes about in the book is just the endless, relentless relationship building. Just talking to your fellow Americans about the gay community and getting people more comfortable with LGBTQ people, and the book talks quite a bit about Dave Fleischer and this leadership lab at the LGBT Center. Can you talk a little bit about your work in this space, just convincing fellow Californians, Angelenos, Americans, and some lessons learned from that experience as we went up to Prop 8, past Prop 8, toward the 2015 decision?
Sure, thanks. And I just want to say I'm the deputy director of the Leadership Lab, not of the LGBT Center. Whoa, that would be a big job.
Okay.
But I had the great good fortune to live in Kentucky when a lot of the DOMA, Defensive Marriage Act, started. That's where I first met Evan. And then, of course, we were in that first round of ballot measures in 2004, which we all lost miserably. But it still gave us that opportunity, both in 1995 and in 2004, to actually begin to talk with people. And to talk with people, first, of course, we began talking with people about the right to get married. And it was probably through our 2004 campaigns into 2006 and starting here in California in 2008 that we really knew that it was about changing hearts and minds. It was about talking about love. It was about talking about falling in love and really beginning to have those kinds of conversations so that people would really understand that a straight person would understand, an ally would understand that the way they fell in love, the way they decided to get married, the way they decided to have a family was exactly the same way that my wife and I decided to get married too. And I think that's something that was really pretty significant. Yeah.
And did you find that experience? I mean, did you find in your own life that the types of conversations you were having really changed from the 90s up to the 2010s? I mean, there was a tangible difference in the kinds of conversations you were having.
Yeah, absolutely. I think not only were the conversations different, but in the 90s, starting to have a conversation with someone, you almost started from a place of fear, that there might be some backlash, maybe some apology. But as we grew, I mean, that was the cool thing about the marriage movement, or even about the fight for gay rights, in non-discrimination protections. It's like everybody that joins it gets to have a different kind of voice. So by the time we really got to, especially California in 2008, we launched that nonprofit, Let California Ring. And we really incited almost people to talk about their relationships, to talk about who they loved and why they loved them in a way that was pretty revolutionary, I think, for our movement. So, but no question.
Okay. And by the Leadership Lab is an initiative of the LGBT Center. That's
correct.
Okay.
That's
Gotcha.
correct.
All right.
Yeah.
Good.
Yes.
Thank you. All right. So let's broaden it out, Evan. You've been at the heart of this fight for so long. First of all, any candid reactions as to Sasha's book, and do you want to make some comments about this incredible shift in public opinion and what you saw as being most effective in making that happen?
Well, as Kathleen alluded to, and as you've said, Senator, and as Sasha said, this has been a very long fight. I mean, I myself worked on it for, you could say, 32 years from the time I wrote my law school thesis in 1983 until we won in 2015. And of course, I continue to work, as do others, on the global fights that you talked about, as well as sharing the lessons from our success with other movements here in the US, whether it be immigrant rights, women's rights, gun control, saving our democracy, et cetera. So, and yet, long as my work in it was, I wasn't the first. I mean, when I wrote my paper, I was writing about the brave pioneers and the early couples in the early 70s who themselves were drawing from debates that had taken place in our movement in the 50s and 60s. The first edition of One magazine, this very early gay rights manifesto, had this homosexual marriage cover story about the debate within the movement. So it took us decades to win. And one of the consequences of a long struggle and a long movement and a long piece of work like that is, as Kathleen said, everyone has their take, everyone has their piece, everyone remembers the parts they remember, people are often moved by the parts they're involved in, et cetera. And there is no one exact true story that's going to cover everybody's perception. So there are many, many things in Sasha's book that are extraordinarily valuable and deep. And I love the fact that he dove so deep into the Hawaii chapter, which is a chapter that, though from my point of view, in a sense, really the turning point from the early phase where we had begun losing to the phase in which we began winning, even though much of that winning phase was a lot of losses in the beginning. But I always saw it as winning from that point on. And Sasha lifts that story up. He lifts up many of the other parts of the story that people don't know as much about. That said, I, like everyone, will have different takes on certain things and have my own perceptions, and I will think they're right, and other people might think, well, that's what you saw, but you didn't see this. So that's, I think, the spirit in which you have to look at any of these histories, any of these discussions. They're very valuable contributions to our richer understanding of what is not just, one person or one thing or one battle or one methodology or 1 year or even 1 decade. It was multiple decades with many players and many parts. That said, there was a strategy, and that strategy took root very early on, and we stuck with that strategy. And by learning how to do what the strategy required, and by recruiting the support that was needed for the strategy, and by building the resources and the alliances and the coalitions and the organizations and the campaigns that the strategy called for, the strategy that we had prefigured for decades actually did win, even though many people may not have even known there was a strategy, and not everybody agreed on the strategy.
I was struck by the passage in the book about some of the postmortems on Prop 8. I mean, that must have been just such a, I remember that. I'll never forget that night, because that was the night I was first elected to office. I was elected to the school board in Santa Monica. We were so also jubilant about the Obama victory, at least amongst my group. But of course, Prop 8. I mean, what is your, looking back, why did Prop 8 pass? And what did you take from that experience to change the trajectory of of your work in the movement?
So Prop 8 it's a great example, especially speaking to my friends in California, because in California, of course, it was received as this catastrophe and really sent many people into an almost 2-year dysfunctional spiral of not knowing what to make of it, despair, anger, frustration, sometimes turning on ourselves, sometimes just not knowing. And meanwhile, in 2009, despite the blow and unfairness of Prop 8, we went on to the winningest year we had had. We won several more states. We saw public opinion close in on that majority we've been working to build, in part because of the wake-up call that Prop 8 delivered with all its pain. So for those of us who were not based in California, though I worked hand in glove with so many Californians and California organizations like the LA Center, we understood that this was a painful loss, very, very unfair, very excruciating, and yet not the end of the story. And in fact, it was an example of what I described as, to my movement friends, losing forward. That it was not a win, and we wanted that win, and we should have had that win. And I can answer why I think we didn't get the win, but it wasn't the end either, which is how some people received it. It was an opportunity for us to lose forward, to take the gains, to take the wake-up call, to take the redoubling of commitment that it inspired in many, and the action that it brought to bear, and to learn how to begin winning. And Prop 8 really was not the last campaign that we ran the wrong campaign in, but it was the next to last. And it was the one that really lit the fire under key players to figure out how could we do something we hadn't yet learned how to do, which was how to win a ballot measure. We had learned how to win in court. We had learned how to win in states, legislatures. We had learned how to win in coastal states, as well as states in the heartland of the country. We had learned how to move public opinion. We hadn't yet learned how to get and hold a majority for a ballot measure. But Prop 8 helped pave the way with the next disappointment we had in Maine, and another one we had in North Carolina, actually, so that we began learning how to do it, and critically getting the key players, organizations, as well as funders, as well as activists and volunteers, to do the work that was necessary to win, which Prop 8 again underscored for us. And as a result, in 2012, building on what we had learned and what we were able to build, we went on to win 4 out of 4. Now it's a huge turning point politically that shifted the dynamic, setting the stage for us to win in the Supreme Court in 2013, to win in a wave of courts and legislatures following that, and ultimately 2 years later to win in the US Supreme Court nationally. So there were things we could have done better in California, and we probably could have figured out how to get that win and how to have that win then. But the fact that we didn't wasn't the end of the fight either.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. All right. Let's turn to our to Seppi. You know, I'd love some reflections on the discussion so far. The extent to which you feel that so a little bit of a reflection on the discussion so far, but also I want to ask you. I know you help LGBT candidates for office. Obviously, you've been successful, but I dare say maybe it's a little easier to be an LGBT out person running for office in West Hollywood than elsewhere. So do you have some thoughts as you have been helping other candidates in other parts of the country about some of the continuing barriers that impact political power building for the LGBTQ community?
Sure. Well, first I'll start with some reflections. And I just wanted, Sasha, there's 69 countries still as of this year where homosexuality is criminalized. More than half of them are in Africa. Kathleen, so true. We were afraid to come out. And part of the reason why we were afraid to come out and really share our stories in the 90s is because, and even into the early 2000s, in the United States, homosexuality was still criminalized until Lawrence v. Texas in 2003 struck down our anti-sodomy laws. So it was really until then. And then also Evan, thank you, because you had a vision and you carried it through. And I know for a fact that a lot of LGBTQ leaders didn't believe it was the right time. People that I looked up to is I went to law school in 1999 or 2000, 2002, and I advocated for our community since then for years and years. And there were people in the movement in our own community that kept saying, it'll be 50 years, it'll be 100 years. And then when Evan and other leaders like him came and said, okay, no, let's take this to the Supreme Court, a lot of people were like, whoa, wait, what? So thank you for doing that, because your vision.
I mean, in retrospect,
Yeah.
In retrospect, Seppi, it's good they did it when they did, because it's unclear that this current court would have made the same decision.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, yes. And it was all perfect timing. In Prop 8, I was actually the co-president of the Lesbian Gay Lawyers Association when Prop 8 was put on the ballot, and we were doing what we could to fight that. One thing I will say about Prop 8 and the campaign is, unfortunately, a lot of communities of color were left out of that conversation, and left out in a way where they weren't targeted properly. And so that's my take on it. And again, it comes out to reaching all different constituency groups, which leads into your question about helping LGBTQ candidates. I did a lot of that when my second stint with the Human Rights Campaign, because I was on the board of governors, very involved with HRC Los Angeles on the steering committee, and then we got marriage equality, and I thought, okay, time to pass the torch. I'm fine. I'm gonna get married. I'm gonna get married myself. Let me focus on my relationship and marriage and all that. And then Trump happened, and I went back. But in the second time I got involved with the Human Rights Campaign, we did a lot of work helping LGBTQ candidates, Katie Hill, and doing a lot of phone banking for her and others. And now Victory Institute does a lot of that. I think that it's important to do exactly the same thing that candidates did, that people were doing during the fight for marriage equality, which is sharing our stories. Sharing our stories, being vulnerable, that's a big part of it. And then another part of it too, and this whole key to getting marriage equality from what I saw, is educating people as to what rights marriage gives you, and honestly educating straight folks that didn't even realize that, thousands of, what was it, like almost 1,300, something like that, rights. They didn't even know those rights existed. And then a lot of the response would be, well, why couldn't you just have civil union? Why not? It gives you the same thing. Well, explaining why that's not equal, because it's separate. So those are the kind of the three keys that I saw. But with LGBTQ candidates, again, sharing your story of why you're running, why it's important to have, why the candidate should be at the table. And yes, it is, sure, we we're a LGBTQ city, but I will say that I'm also only the second lesbian ever to be on the West Hollywood City Council in 35 years. So to run as a woman of color, a lesbian in an LGBTQ city had its challenges as well.
Yeah. Do you want to speak a little bit more on how you see the unique challenges of people of color stepping forward within the LGBT community to run for office? I mean, is there a whole nother set? I mean, obviously all these challenges are so intersectional, but given your experience, anything you want to kind of dig into on that question?
Absolutely. People of color, people in the BIPOC communities predominantly make less income than our white counterparts. So just that in itself, in the ability to fundraise, in the need to fundraise all the money you need to run a campaign, and also depending on what office you get into. West Hollywood City Council is a part-time position. It's a full-time work for a part-time position. I think we make maybe 50 cents an hour after all the work we put in. But there's cities that I have friends that are in Morgan Hill City Council, for example. They make nothing. And so this is it's a big problem, because what ends up happening is wealthy folks are able to really run and able to sustain being in office. So that in itself is a barrier for the BIPOC community, not seeing yourself in office. I know that once I got into office, I had so many queer Iranian females calling me and saying, oh my gosh, I'm thinking of running. They're in this next race for West Hollywood City Council. There's already 4 BIPOC people that want to run. It's unheard of. And it's because they see themselves, a little bit of themselves, and they see, wow, she did it, so I can too.
Fantastic. It's good. It's good. It's a beautiful, it's so important too. Let me ask a question about, you know, we talked about the current court. There's obviously some, I mean, we got a lot of lawyers here on this panel. Do any of you guys want to comment on whether you think that Obergefell is really safe? I mean, Roe v. Wade is now being, I think, seriously called into question. But maybe as you know, one of my favorite chapter title in the book, Sasha's, for the last chapter of the book, he talks about massive desistance. The idea being that all of this resistance to marriage equality kind of dissipated and quickly moved on to other things to an extent that I think was pretty extraordinary and unpredictable. So, so maybe in this case, Obergefell really is strong and it really is safe. But certainly some of the jurisprudence and some of the discussion around some other topics, given how conservative the court has suddenly become, you know, makes me wonder. So I just want to throw this out. I mean, Evan, let me start with you. I mean, do you think Obergefell's safe?
I think there are so many important things that we need to be concerned about that, though anything can happen and we shouldn't be complacent about anything, the prospect of losing the freedom to marry is not the thing I put most of my time and energy into being concerned about. I think we have to, number one, above everything, be concerned about our democracy itself. We have to defend our democracy and reinvigorate our democracy. And, you know, that people know that deals with reform of the courts. It deals with ending voter suppression. It deals with ending gerrymandering. It deals with reinvigorating our civic infrastructure. I don't mean physical, I mean our sense of a civil society in which Americans are not divided against each other in the same way. It means combating racial injustice. It means combating economic inequality. All these things. And the Supreme Court's, the currently packed Supreme Court's agenda against most of those things are what we have to be more worried about than that they are going to reverse themselves on the freedom to marry itself, which is not to say that's impossible, but I don't think that's likely. And part of the reason I don't think that's likely is that as Sasha's book describes, and as we've already all talked about, we didn't win the freedom to marry as a legal strategy. Yes, there was a legal element in our strategy, and it was always about creating the climate in which we could get one actor, the Supreme Court, to bring the country to nationwide resolution. But the strategy talked about working politically, legally, culturally, socially, organizationally, and through the powerful engine of conversation and personal change in order to then win legally. So we did not win this as a gift from the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court is aware of that, and the political climate of our country is aware of that. You saw Obama just referencing this, you know, a couple of days ago, or yesterday, I think it was, in his campaigning in Virginia now, where he made fun of the Republican candidate for not being willing to say he supports the freedom to marry, although even Republicans who say they don't support the freedom to marry say they're going to abide by the law, that it's the settled law of the land. So I don't think we should be sitting here tonight worrying that the Supreme Court is going to take away the freedom to marry. We should be worrying that the Supreme Court is going to further encroach on the rights of women and the empowerment of women, on our democracy, on campaign finance, on economic equality, et cetera. And we need to deal with that and get engaged. And I also don't think we should be sitting around worrying at all. We should be working.
It is so interesting that, you know, I mean, and maybe it's such a reflection of what you just talked about, that when asked, I mean, Sasha writes about this, when Donald Trump basically kind of, he said, oh, it's the law of the land, you know, it is what it is. You know, I don't really love it, but, you know, and people kind of, he just decided to to just sort of roll with it, and of course he was so actively engaged in so many other aspects of the culture wars, as we know.
Yeah,
but this was one topic.
But I will point out, much more important than what politicians say is what they do, with all due respect. And so, they say that, but then he appoints judges, he appoints officials, he issued directives throughout his administration aimed at trying to not directly attack the freedom to marry, but to undermine LGBT rights and inclusion, as well as a host of other things we all care about. Leading Republicans in the Texas state legislature just sent a letter, I think it was a couple of days ago, to, now I forget whether it was to the governor or to the state attorney general, basically saying we should not follow the Supreme Court's dictates on the freedom to marry. Now, I don't think that's going to go anywhere, but it does indicate that just because we won doesn't mean we've changed everything. No victory is the end of everything. And so we need to keep harnessing the power of what we've won, including the support, the assets, the allies, the learnings, to the work at hand as we keep building on what we've done.
Yeah. So Kathleen, what are you working on now? I mean, with that in mind, what's your what are you taking from this experience, and what's the next step? What's the next fight for you?
Yeah, thanks. Just to come off though of what Evan said, in Kentucky, where we had that clerk who said she was not going to give marriage licenses to same-sex couples, right? And everybody was like, what is she talking about? Well, she got away with it. And not only did she get away with it, but she actually helped the next governor, who was a Republican governor and very conservative, get elected when he posed with her, and so I do think that while, yes, nationally, it's very safe, there is some whittling away that can happen kind of at the almost grassroots level. The thing that the Leadership Lab is working on is the same thing that we started working on in 2009 after we lost Prop 8. And that is beginning to understand this idea of deep canvassing, this idea of long form conversations, and how can we use it not just on issues of same-sex marriage as we did, and transgender rights, but how can we use it to actually get more low propensity voters out to vote? And we've been doing that since 2018. We're having a lot of success down in Orange County. We're having a lot of success in starting to build teams of low propensity voters so that there can be almost like the old precinct captain way, this kind of neighborhood, think of United Farm Workers, this idea that people are going to forge a personal path as well as a political path to the voting booth. And that's what we're working on.
Seppi, let me ask you, does West Hollywood, and I just kind of building off of its role in the book, like, does it see itself as a city, right? But as a special kind of city that has been an important haven for LGBT folks for so long. Does West Hollywood see a special role in this future battle that it can play as a city, as a polity, as an entity?
I mean, absolutely. We take positions and pass resolutions on regional and worldwide issues often. And we really, we were the first city that had domestic partnership rights. We were the first majority gay municipality, the first city to have a lesbian mayor anywhere in the world. She was there for 1 year, but still. And we have the majority of our city is not LGBTQ, but we have probably the largest majority of LGBTQ in our city, which is about 40%. Yeah. And so we do take opportunities to partner with organizations, and we will certainly stand side by side in the fight for any future fights we still have, and we have many. So, and currently, I think the fights are really for our transgender folks. We had a big win that marriage equality didn't really address for Californians, when we had marriage equality, my wife and I were so happy, and she turned to me and said, "Oh my God, my LGBTQ friends in Ohio, they're not going to be able to get married because they'll get fired the next day."
Right.
And just recently, we finally, through the Supreme Court, got employment rights and some transgender rights, but there's still a lot of work to do. And West Hollywood would definitely be on the forefront of that work as much as we can.
I know you will. Sasha, what, so two questions, and then I want to wrap up. What's your next project, first of all?
I've been digging into a historic election fraud scandal that took place in Terre Haute, Indiana, a little over a century ago. And there's a kind of glorious history to fighting real election fraud that has been, I think, distorted by some folks of late. And I think that sort of explaining how Americans cleaned up our elections a century ago can be a sort of instructive tale at this moment.
Good. So that's very timely, unfortunately. And then, hearing your story about this whole work, it made me think a lot about Robert Caro, who, set out to just do a little project writing a little bit about Lyndon Baines Johnson. And of course, decades and decades later, he's still on, volume 5, and he hasn't finished. And, this must be, I remember how good I felt when I finished a college paper. This must be just such a different experience getting so deep into issue. What did this book, this is, I think, the longest project you've had in your career. What did this book teach you about writing and research, and about our nation's politics? Can you, as probably the only person who's delved so deeply into a topic and written a book about it, can you give us some words of wisdom about the research and writing process, having gone through this experience?
Yeah, I didn't know this when I went into it, but I ended up picking what I think is a sort of wonderfully fertile period historically to be writing about, which is, I think I have a journalist toolkit here, but a sort of historian's curiosities. And one of the great things is that the events I was writing about were just far enough in the past that there was often documentary trail I could get my hands on through archives or through people's personal holdings that they would feel free sharing with me, because the cases or legal fights or legislative battles or ballots that they'd been working on were far enough in the past that I could get a hold of their correspondence or memos or internal notes, but also recent enough that almost every significant figure I write about in this book is still alive. Some of them chose not to talk to me, but they were almost all available. And one of the things that I think you go back much farther in the past, and maybe there's a little bit more paper you can get a hold of, and you do stuff more recently, and maybe people's memories are a little fresher. But what I hope delivers a lot of the richness on the page is that I was able to have a documentary record about what people were saying and doing and thinking in real time, but then also augment it with interviews that I did that helped sort of round out the context in which they were having those thoughts or making their decisions. And, one of the things that was really important to me, in part because, as we talked about, like, we as a country sort of stumbled into this fight in the 1990s. Nobody really understood that we were at the beginning of something that we were going to look back on as a sort of, momentous generational civil rights conflict. And so I wanted to show people sort of processing this in real time, and not just, with the benefit of hindsight, knowing that this would sort of end up where it did before the Supreme Court. And so, that was the thing that I found myself sort of blessed by was being able to have both live sources and a lot of paper.
Yeah. Well, that's the beauty of history. I think, I just saw Hamilton again for the second time, which is such a wonderful experience. And remembering just reading that Chernow book as well. There's, what makes history so fascinating. And of course, the folks on this call know this well, but I think younger people look back, they take a lot of this for granted. They think, oh, this is always an inevitability. And yet your book really does such a good job of pointing out how tenuous this fight was. So many steps along the way, and how it just took tenacious, tactical people working really hard and winning over people's hearts and minds to get to this incredible victory. And by the way, we're now on a whole new set we have a whole new set of fights and challenges, as I think Evan and Seppi so eloquently described. So congratulations to you, Sasha. Really, it's a special accomplishment. Obviously, congratulations to Seppi and Evan and Kathleen for your successes, which are ultimately at the heart of the subject matter of the book. So I want to send you all a big hug, all four of you. I want to thank everyone for participating. I want to give a big thank you to Davis Hahn on my staff, who is just the best. He's a new on our team, but has been just hit the ground running and really helped to put this event together so successfully. So thank you, Davis and Rad and everybody else on the team. And then I want to just say we're hoping to do this some more, and we're tentatively looking at December 1st right now to talk to Lisa Greer, who wrote her book Philanthropy Revolution. More details to come on that. Looking in the next year to talk to Charles Yu, Interior Chinatown. Heather McGee, my law school classmate, and talk to her about her book in the coming year. So we've got some good other books that are relevant and policy oriented, but also that give a real window into the complexity of our society and some of the challenges we face right now. So big thank you. Thank you, Sasha. Congratulations, Sasha. Thank you, Seppi, Evan, Kathleen,
Thanks
Davis.
for having us.
Really do appreciate this discussion.
Thanks, Senator.
Bye, everyone.
Bye. Stay well.
And
everybody.
Evan, get some rest. I feel bad for keeping you up so late.
Not to worry. Thank you.
Thanks, guys.